With AMD's new AM5 socket and the associated Zen4 processors, there are various chipset options and an insane range of motherboards to choose from. I count more than 80 boards from just 4 of the largest vendors, and this is just for the B650 and the X670 chipset options. So it's hard to know which choice is right for you, and it's all blurred by LEDs and graphics, each manufacturer's sub-branding, the buzzwords they use, and features that you may or may not need or even benefit from. So today I'm going to show you what the differences really are between the two main chipset options and what it really means for system performance and experience. I'm going to ignore the LED panels and branding and focus on what each chipset offers in terms of I/O and PCIe options and performance specifically. Also, cut through the hypothetical and talk about what you really get from these options on actual motherboards to help you understand what chipset might be best for your needs and give you the best value for money. If you do get value from this video, please do click the like button because it does really help out, and if you want to see more of this, you can subscribe to get some of this in your feed. So I'm going to pick 5 offerings from the Asus range of boards just to use as examples and show you what you actually get on the boards for I/O, specifically M.2 storage, PCIe graphics and slot availability. And the goal is to give you the knowledge that you need to go look at the huge range of boards you can get and pick one that works for you. I'm going to use Asus as examples, but each brand will use the same chipsets and you can go look at what you get from each board for your preferred manufacturer. Now, I'm not going to cover memory today, but it is worth knowing that the AM5 socket boards only support DDR5 memory. So whatever board you choose, you're going to be looking at getting new memory, and the choices are still limited in terms of speed potential, and due to some component constraints, the DDR5 options are still pretty expensive, but DDR5 does offer performance improvements as well as options for more system RAM capacity. First, to set the scene for what's going to come, a very brief look at PCIe speeds and performance, so you can put this into context. This table shows you all the bandwidth numbers for the various PCIe versions and lane counts. Each iteration broadly doubles the throughput, all the way from PCIe 1 up through to PCIe 7, with slight variances due to changes in encoding, etc. The AM5 socket boards we look at today are the first AMD boards to offer PCIe Gen 5, but also provide Gen 3 and Gen 4, and although PCIe 6 standards are set, you probably won't be seeing boards using this for at least a year or two. The previous AM4 boards that the Ryzen 3000 and 5000 chips went in introduced PCIe Gen 4, and the new range introduced Gen 5, but as you will see, it's used in very specific places, and we will talk about the benefits that it really provides. Firstly, a quick review of the chipset architectures for both the B650 and the X670, starting with the B650. Both of these chipsets use the same proprietary 21 chips from AS Media, with the B650 and B650E having a single chip, consuming around 7 watts. Any PCIe5 lanes that are present are straight to the CPU, along with high bandwidth interfaces like DisplayPort, which is around 80 gigabits per second. There are 4 PCIe4 downlinks to the chipset, which then provides connectivity to the majority of the I/O, such as networking, SATA, wireless, USB, etc. Also, additional PCIe connectivity not on the CPU, such as expansion and M.2 slots. As we will see on the boards we look at, much of the connectivity is via the uplink, which is around 8 GB per second each way. The PROM21 chip has a total of 12 PCIe 4 lanes and 4 PCIe 3 lanes available, which are allocated to various connectivity, such as motherboard slots, USB, disk access and networking. 4 of the Gen 4 lanes on this chip are used as an uplink to the CPU. You can think of this and other chipsets as a PCIe switch, providing connectivity and aggregating it for delivery to and from the CPU via its 4-lane uplink. If any of this is a bit confusing, don't worry, because we're going to actually look at some motherboards and show what it looks like in real life on actual motherboards to make it clearer. So next, a graphic of the X670 chipset layout. This uses the same chip as the B650, but it uses 2 of them. The chips are chained together to provide additional I/O capacity, but the connectivity to the CPU is still via the same 4-lane uplink. Each of the PROM21 chips again provide 12 PCIe Gen 4 lanes and 4 Gen 3 lanes. However, now the first chip is consuming 8 of its 12 lanes in uplink and downlink channels, leaving just 4 Gen 4 lanes and 4 Gen 3 lanes for I/O. As we will see on the board connectivity as we look at it, this can result in slot sharing resources, and meaning that enabling one, such as an M.2 slot, disables the associated PCIe 4-lane motherboard slot. The X670 architecture does provide more connectivity and more bandwidth, but it comes with its own constraints. Again, all of the PCIe Gen 5 connectivity is straight to the AM5 processor socket, and the PROM21 chips provide no Gen 5 lanes, either for uplink or for I/O. It's worth noting that these diagrams are not official schematics, but they do come from Astronomics, who are a semiconductor analyst. As we look at the board layout and the I/O capacity of our example motherboards, we will see that all the numbers add up in terms of what is available on boards with these chipsets. So the goal is to cut through the marketing and see what you really get with these boards. And to that end, here is a quick reference table of the lane availability for each chipset with the AM5 socket. There are some optionals here, and just because the lanes are available, it doesn't mean they're always implemented by board manufacturers. Specifically, we see that the B650 comes with no PCIe 5 lanes, but 4 are optional. And depending on the board you buy, these lanes may provide Gen 5 lanes for NVMe storage, or that storage may be on Gen 4 lanes. So check this on the boards you are considering if this is important to you. I have seen marketing material that says things like PCIe5 everywhere for the X670E chipset, but I have not seen data that supports that. And you can see here that actually each of these comes with a mix of PCIe Gen 5, Gen 4 and Gen 3 lanes. And this is because of what we saw on the Promontory 21 chip layouts just now. There just isn't the raw lane support for PCIe 5 on the CPU socket to provide connectivity, and this is the job of the chipset. But to put this into perspective, PCIe 4 is fast, and for many applications, PCIe Gen 3 is also more than sufficient. So this isn't a bad thing, it's just something to understand. Now, we're going to cut through to the meat of this and provide some examples of different boards with different chipsets and see how the bandwidth is actually delivered. There are so many AM5 boards available. I did a quick tally and I could find 36 from Asus, 21 from Gigabyte, 14 from MSI and 15 from ASRock just to get started. So I'm going to show you some analysis on a selection of boards with these chipsets to act as a baseline to start from. I have picked 5 boards from the Asus lineup, and this is really so it's easier to compare the features and prices of boards from a single manufacturer, but this should provide you the info you need to go and look at others as well. This diagram from Tech Power Up does a great job at describing how Asus segments its products, with the prime boards offering less in the way of cosmetic frills like RGB and graphics for professionals such as content creators, graphics and video artists. And then gamers have 3 tiers of products: the Ultimate Force products, or TUF, and then Republica Gamers products with the Strix product line for mainstream, and a variety of boards in the ROG lineup depending on your CPU type. I picked 5 boards through the lineup with a focus on PCIe and I/O connectivity options, and I didn't look at other value add capabilities like BIOS options, overclocking, troubleshooting, tooling and visuals. First, I chose 2 boards from the B650 chipset, a Prime and a TUF gaming board. Then a B650E board from the ROG Strix lineup. Then I chose an X670 board from the Prime product stack. And finally a top of the line X670E ROG Crosshair board. You can see that the prices escalate rapidly as you get higher in the pyramid. So the question is, what do you get for your money there? I took examples from Newegg in the US and from scan.co.uk in the UK. Note that UK figures, like many places in the world, include sales tax, but in the US, the sales tax can vary depending on where the buyer is, so those numbers are without tax. So let's look at these boards in detail and see what we find. First up, starting with the B650 chipset, a Prime board, the Asus Prime B650 Plus. This is a no visual frills board without LEDs, displays and heavy graphics. You can see most of the PCB here, with the exception of heatsinks for the CPU power stages. Primary M.2 slot and the B650 chipset is in the bottom right, which at 7 watts is fine with passive cooling. If we look at the layout, we can see how the connectivity and the bandwidth work. Note that the traces here are not intended to follow the actual board traces, but just illustrate connectivity. First of all, we have the PCIe 5 connection, color-coded in green to the first M.2 slot. The B650 chipset actually has this as optional, so not all boards with this chipset has the Gen 5 connection, but both the Asus boards that we look at today do. This will provide 15.8 gigabytes per second of connectivity each way to the NVMe storage. Next, the PCIe 4 16X connectivity to the PCI expansion slot. Gen 4 lanes are shown in purple. And a second M.2 slot connected directly to the CPU at 4 times PCI speeds of 7.9 gigabytes per second. The B650 architecture offers up to 24 Gen 4 lanes for use to the CPU, but as 4 of the lanes are set for optional PCIe 5, there are only 20 unreserved lanes available. Then we have the connectivity to the chipset over the reserved PCIe4 4-channel, also for 7.9 GB per second. The chipset then provides connectivity to the 4-channel PCIe4 slot and 2 single-channel slots. It can then also provide connectivity to I/O such as SATA, networking, etc. over the 6 remaining lanes mixed between Gen 3 and Gen 4. Note that the documentation does not state how many lanes are connected to I/O, but these are the lanes that are available for use. We will also see in a later board example how lane availability can mean that certain I/O is disabled in certain configurations. Note that all the connectivity in the bottom right, including the PCIe 4X and 1X slots, networking and storage ultimately share the Gen 4 4 lanes from the chipset to the CPU. This isn't unreasonable, and it assumes that you would be unlikely that all of these slots will be running at max capacity, but it's something to understand when selecting where to put your devices in the system. Next, we take a look at the Asus TUF Gaming B650 Plus board. Asus' more entry-level offering aimed at the gaming market. Again, the board isn't full of frills. There is more branding and graphics, and a visual focus on the TUF brand with its industrial feel. And this board provides more power connectivity to the CPU, with more cooling for the CPU VRM stages, and small heat sinks for the primary M.2 slot and the B650 chipset, again in the bottom right quarter. Again, there is a 4X Gen 5 lanes for the primary M.2 slot, giving 15.8 GB per second of bidirectional connectivity. The B650 non-E variant doesn't offer PCIe 5 support for the 16X slot, so this is provided at PCIe 4 speed for 31.5 GB of connectivity, still twice the bandwidth of the primary M.2 slot. This board also offers a second M.2 slot connected directly to the CPU over a 4X PCIe 4 connection for 7.9 GB of connectivity, half that of the PCIe5 M.2 slot. Then we have the 4-lane PCIe 4 connectivity to the chipset, which provides the remaining I/O including the 4X Gen 4 slot and 2 1X slots. There is also a third M.2 socket here, but as the B650 chip only has 8 available PCIe 4 lanes, populating this slot will disable the 4X PCIe connector. Finally, there are 2 remaining Gen 4 and 4 Gen 3 channels available for I/O connectivity, including the 2.5 gigabits per second Ethernet and 4 SATA 6 gigabit per second ports. We now move on to the B650E variant. The extreme version of the chipset primarily adds support for PCIe5 X16X support, enabling the potential for PCIe5 GPUs, which, as a note, do not really exist currently. Here we look at the Asus ROG Strix B650EF gaming board. This board is positioned for gamers and has a lot more branding and graphics along with LEDs in the I/O area at the back. Larger heatsinks with more cooling for the CPU power stages, along with 3 M.2 slots and the B650 chipset again in the bottom right. It has a button for releasing the GPU from the X16 slot, which might be gimmicky, but if you actually need to remove a GPU, it can be a real pain now with their size to actually get to the release clip on the slot. If we look at the component layout, it again looks familiar from the TUF board. PCIe 5 connectivity is provided over a 4X bus to the primary M.2 slot for 15.8 GB of connectivity, and to the 16X bus where the GPU would normally reside for a tasty 63 GB each way. Of course, even the most recent AMD 7K and Nvidia 4K series are still PCIe Gen 4, but this opens up options for the future. Again, the CPU has a secondary M.2 slot connected at 4X Gen 4 speeds for 7.9 GB per second, still half that of the primary slot. The 4 PCIe 4 lanes connect down to the B650 chipset, which again provides connectivity to a 4-lane and 2 1-lane PCIe slots. There is also a third M.2 slot, like in the TUF board, and again, due to the limit of 8 available Gen 4 lanes on the chipset, use of this will disable the PCIe 4 slot. There remains 2 PCIe 4 lanes and 4 PCIe 3 lanes for I/O. So here we can see that this is really just the same as a TUF board from a connectivity perspective, with just the availability of PCIe 5 for the GPU slot added. Next we move up to the X670 chipset and look at the prime X670P motherboard. This board hits a lower price point than the ROG Strix board, and it has the X670 chipset, but it doesn't have the PCIe Gen 5 connectivity to the GPU slot. Again, it's a simpler board without lots of graphics and RGB, but does offer an 8+4 power connector to the CPU socket. There is more heatsink coverage for the CPU power stages, which are very similar to those on the B650 variants. This also covers the I/O part of the board, and a larger heatsink is added to cover both the chipset chips. However, again with the X670 chipset, active cooling isn't needed, unlike its X570 predecessor, which was often fan-cooled due to higher power draw and heat generation density. The X670 uses two of the same chips used in the B650, the Promontory 21 chip, so draws around 7 plus 7 watts. In addition, spreading the chipset over two chips spreads heat generation, meaning that the passive cooling is simpler. If we look at the connectivity, we see again there's a 4-lane PCIe5 connection to the primary M.2 slot, which is standard on the X670 chipset. There is a 16-lane connection to the PCIe4 16X slot and an additional 4-lane PCIe4 connection to a secondary M.2 socket directly from the CPU. The CPU has a 4 times PCIe4 downlink to one of the PROM21 chips, which in turn has another 4 times PCIe4 connection to its twin. This means that of the 12 available PCIe4 lanes, 8 are taken up with just the chipset uplinks and downlinks on one of these chips. This leaves one of the X670 chips with 4 remaining PCIe4 lanes to service the final M.2 slot and another 8 lanes for the 4 times PCIe sockets. That leaves up to 8 PCIe 3 lanes for I/O. Now, there's a remaining 1 times PCIe 3 slot, but using this reduces bandwidth to the I/O and means that 2 of the 6 SATA ports are disabled. Remaining I/O such as high-speed USB etc. is provided straight to the CPU. So, going from the B650 to the X670 effectively provides 4 additional PCIe 4 lanes and 4 additional PCIe 3 lanes for I/O, meaning that this board can host 3 M.2 slots without contention for the PCIe slots, though in honesty, most users will leave those 4X slots unused and may not even use all the M.2 storage either. Again, it's worth noting that due to the daisy chain of the PROM21 chips used in the chipset, all the connectivity provided by both of these has to pass over the same 4X PCIe4 channel to the CPU. Again, this is only a concern if those components are utilizing more than 7.9 GB of traffic regularly. And finally, we move on to the ROG Crosshair X670E Hero, which is near the top of the pricing structure for these boards. This board is marketed to AAA gamers, whatever those are, presumably those that are willing to pay for the best. This board is mostly covered in panels and heatsinks, not revealing much about the PCB and preserving the aesthetics. There is a 2 times 8-pin EPS connector for the CPU, which would provide up to 672 watts to the socket and power stages. It also adds an additional PCIe 3-pin power connector by the 24-pin P1 power connector, providing an additional 75 watts of power for the mainboard and PCI slots. This allows for the use of 2 GPUs in this board, assuming your case has the needed clearance. If we overlay the connectivity diagram, we see what's going on under the covers. With a 4-lane PCIe5 connection to the first M.2 slot, we also see a 16-lane PCIe5 connection to the first GPU slot, and actually, the second 16X socket and the second M.2 slot are also connected to these PCIe5 lanes. However, this is still only a 16-lane connection, so using either the second PCIe slot or the M.2 number 2 socket will result in the primary 16X socket being bifurcated into an 8 times socket. Even an 8 times PCIe5 socket produces 31.5 GB of bandwidth, the same as a 16X PCIe4. But, that said, if you put an M.2 NVMe card in that slot, the GPU socket will then be 8 lanes, and if your current card is PCIe 4, which for the foreseeable future it will be, then you will have 8x of a PCIe 4 as a maximum. So, probably, this isn't recommended if you're running a high-end GPU, and let's be honest, if you're spending $650 on a gaming motherboard, you probably don't cheap out on the GPU. Next we see that, just as with the X670 chipset, the X670E has a 4-lane PCIe 4 connection down to the first PROM21 chip, and then another across to the second. This works in the same way as the X670 chipset. This leaves 4 PCIe 4 lanes on the first X670 chip and 8 on the second, which can be used for the remaining 2 M.2 sockets and the single other PCI slot on the board, a single lane PCIe 4 connector. This leaves plenty of bandwidth over for I/O, and it looks like much of that could be left on the table. And again, as with all these chipset options, much of that I/O is behind that 4-lane connection from the chipset to the CPU. So this board is great for providing high-speed storage with 2 M.2 slots able to run at PCIe 5 4-lane speeds, But doing that probably compromises your GPU, so depending on what you're doing with this board, that may not be useful. Other than this, it may not offer any real advantage over the X670 chipset, other than a future option to fit a PCIe5 GPU. As these won't be available for a year or two at best, and as we will talk about next, may not even benefit from that 16x PCIe5 bandwidth, it is a big question if this board is really worth the hefty price tag. It certainly looks nice, but is that enough? I think that's up to you. So let's talk about the conclusions and some of the other things to think about when selecting a chipset for your AM5 socket processor. In summary, I would say that I would be buying one of the B650 boards, but one that provides the PCIe5 lane option for the M.2 slot. Out of the boards I looked at, the Tough board has the option of an extra NVMe drive, but initially I would likely not put a Gen 5 drive in the board until prices settle more and we see some more speed increases. Any of the Zen4 chips can fit in any of these boards, so overclocking options aside, you can get the benefit of the higher end chips but with the lower price motherboards. The memory options are all also basically the same. But there's a lot more to unpack to explain why, so stick around and let's dig into all the reasons. It is easy to be swept up in the performance capability of PCIe Gen 5, but it's worth understanding the real world performance considerations before spending the money. First of all, there are currently no real PCIe5 GPU options, nor any on the short-term horizon, with the new 4000 series from NVIDIA and the 7000 from AMD featuring PCIe 4. There is a Chinese entrant into this space called More Threads that offer the first PCIe5 GPU, but it doesn't yet look to be a credible offering. Given that there are only certain conditions that you may saturate a PCIe 4 16x bus, this choice actually makes sense. For example, modern video cards would not even saturate a PCIe Gen 4 8-lane bus, which provides 16GB per second. A 16-lane PCIe 4 interface currently provides 31.5GB of sustained data transfer in each direction. There may be cases for higher bus bandwidth, such as machine learning applications, but not really in the gaming sphere for now. And if we think about why, it becomes clear. Most of the work a GPU does is onboard the GPU, moving data from GPU memory to GPU core. The time the bus comes into play is mostly during loading your textures, for example, when you start a game or you enter a new area in the game. When this happens, the GPU has to load textures into VRAM, and it gets this from disk via the CPU in most cases, as the textures are loaded from disk, decompressed on the CPU, and then moved to the GPU. Current generation high-performance M.2 storage, such as the Samsung Pro SSD, has a sequential read performance of around 7.5GB a second, which is just inside the spec for PCIe 4 4X. So this is unlikely to be the bottleneck for loading textures, assuming the GPU has adequate memory to store the textures that it's likely to need. This is primarily only going to be an issue at loading points in the game, and many games will preload textures as you move into game areas. So for this, PCIe Gen 4 8X is more than sufficient for now. Games are using higher numbers of textures, and with a move to photorealistic textures, they are getting bigger. So GPU memory is going to be a crunch point, and if your GPU doesn't have enough memory to store those textures, it's going to start fetching them as it needs them across the bus. This will impact game performance, but also will put a strain on that PCIe bus. However, the pinch point isn't really the GPU interface, it's the storage interface where the textures are coming from. So you may get faster load times entering a map, but only if the storage is fast enough to deliver the textures faster. Currently, even Gen 5 storage is reaching maybe 10GB per second, still well below the capacity of PCIe 4 8X, but we will see these speeds grow in the next year. Seeing as mainboards we saw here offer PCIe 5 4X storage, this is 15.8GB max, which is again only enough to saturate a PCIe Gen 4 8-lane bus, even when the storage does get to that speed. And of course, there is DirectStorage that is starting to appear now, which will allow the GPU to load textures and other assets directly from disk and not use the CPU or system RAM. But again, the 4X Gen 5 PCIe bus is only as fast as an 8X PCIe 4 bus, so the need for faster GPU lanes is not really there yet either. So it will likely be a long time until GPUs can operate at PCIe 5 16-lane speeds of 63GB per second, and even then the storage and the PCIe 5 storage interface will be a long way behind that. So unless you plan to keep the board for quite a few years, you are not likely to need or really be able to use the PCIe 5 16X graphics slot support that is offered by the E chipsets. So the main benefit is in the storage speed to the M.2 slot offered by any of the B650 or X670 chipsets here. The B650 has 4 times Gen 5 PCIe for storage as optional, so if you do want this, you need to check the boards you are looking at to make sure they offer it. Many of the B650 boards do, but for example, the Gigabyte B650M only appears to offer M.2 connections at PCIe 4 speed, as does the MSI MPG 650i Edge. For the B650E, 670 and 670E chipsets, they should all offer PCIe5 4X to at least one M.2 slot. So, the PCIe5 storage interface could be interesting. As I expect, M.2 NVMe storage will get faster, but right now it isn't going to offer you a lot. However, the existing fastest NVMe storage devices are already reaching the limit of the PCIe4 4X interface. So PCIe5 here does come with the benefit if you are willing to pay for top-end NVMe storage, and will likely allow you to get faster boot times and game load times, even if it may take a little time for significantly faster NVMe drives to emerge. So my take is not to get too caught up in buying the really high-end X670 boards, as they are very pricey and they may give you limited benefit. The challenge, of course, is that due to how the motherboard manufacturers segment their lineups, they try to push you up the stack with other features. Often superficial ones, such as look and RGB lighting, so it's individual choice if you want to chase those, but as we saw here, the top-end boards are very pricey indeed and may not change your gaming experience in any measurable way. Going for a B650 board with a PCIe5 M.2 slot is probably the sweet spot, and if you have lots of high-speed I/O needs, the X670 offering could be a benefit also, though all the boards here are limited to that PCIe4 4X into the chipset, though for context, that is still nearly 8GB per second bidirectionally. So this wraps up this video, and I hope all the detail was useful in helping you understand what these chipsets and the boards that carries them really offer you. If this content was useful, I would greatly appreciate a like. Also, if you have any comments, believe I missed anything important, or you disagree, then please drop a comment below. I would love to hear from you. And I have more content coming like this, so if you want to keep in touch with that, please do also subscribe to get that into your feed. And with that, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next.